Okay, so let's go back and review the end of book three just briefly, especially the whole idea of the noble lie, what it says, why it's important, and so on. So basically, Socrates, the basic idea here is that every city has inequality. Every city has a hierarchy. Every city is based on that inequality or instantiates it in some way. In other words, every city is in part a system of inequality. And Socrates says this city will be the only one where the hierarchy or the inequality will be based on nature. So the conventional inequality, the conventional hierarchy that exists in the city by the law, will be based on the actual natural inequalities among the different citizens. And so that's the whole point where he has about the education, where he says, we'll have to make sure that people are educated according to their nature. So if somebody is born into the upper level, into the ruling class, but they don't have a good nature, if they're not very bright, not very courageous, not very good preserving these opinions that he focuses on, if they don't seem to have what it would take to be a good ruler, then they have to be demoted down to a lower level. And likewise, if someone is born into the lowest class, but they have all the attributes of a good ruler, if they're intelligent and courageous and learn things quickly and preserve the opinion and do all of these things that they're supposed to do in all of these tests that he says that they'll have for them, then that person needs to rise up in the ranks, maybe to the silver class, to the auxiliary class, or maybe to the guardian class if that's what nature suggests for them. So again, he says, look, all cities have inequalities. In this city, the inequalities will be based on the actual natural inequalities rather than on the conventional or just the accidental fact of where somebody is born, who their parents are, and how that limits where they will end up in society, how the accident of which class they'll be born into directs and limits where they'll actually end up in society. So he says again, inequality, but this inequality will be based on nature. And again, even with all of this stress on the myth, on the idea that the god will destroy the city if a bronze or iron-souled person ever rules, eventually he says we'll have to abolish the family to actually make this happen. People's attachment to their own, in particular to their own children, is too strong, and if we really want them to actually take their children and put them in the right class, not in the class where they think is best for them or where they most want them to be, that would require basically abolishing the family and making it so that no one knows who their own children actually are. You can't prefer your own children if you don't know who they are, so that's what he eventually says is necessary. Okay, but again, the overriding justification for that part of the noble lie, there's obviously the part about the earth being the mother and all the citizens being brothers and sisters. That's clearly meant to promote a stronger sense of community, a stronger sense of attachment to the city, a stronger sense of, again, community or even a family feeling among all the citizens. But then there's the other part involving the metals, and again, the idea is there the inequalities in the city will be based on actual natural inequalities as much as possible. So they move into book four, and at the end of book three, when Socrates says all of this, again, Glaucon doesn't hesitate. He's like, yes, this is certainly, and when Socrates talks about how they won't have any property and how they won't have any privacy, really, the rulers, Glaucon doesn't really hesitate with any of that. He says, yes, that's certainly, that's the way that it will be. Remember, Glaucon wanted the great sacrifices for justice, so he's perfectly okay with this, perfectly comfortable with this setup. At the beginning of, or at least he doesn't object at all. He seems to be comfortable. He seems to even like it and just say, yes, that's right. Let's keep going with this. At the beginning of book four, Adeimantus, Socrates says, interrupts, as if they were headed in some way, and Adeimantus sort of really interrupts, really stops things. And Adeimantus makes an objection. He says, Socrates, what would your apology be? And as the note explains, what would your defense speech be, as if it's a formal accusation, if someone said that you're actually making these men unhappy? These people are the guardians. They're supposed to be the happiest. They're supposed to be happy. The whole point of this was to show that justice will make people happy, and yet these guardians aren't happy. They don't have anything. And here he actually says they'll lack gold and silver and all that's conventionally held to belong to men who are going to be blessed. So here Adeimantus kind of, comes back to well, what is conventionally considered to make somebody happy? Gold and silver, maybe not, mountains of it, but some of it. I mean, these people won't have any property. Socrates even adds to it and says, yes, they won't be able to take private trips or give gifts to lady friends or anything like that. They won't have any money at all. He says you could actually add to it. But, here Adeimantus sort of, although at first he had said, praise justice apart from the consequences. Have people, show people that justice is actually good for its own sake, not good for the consequences. Here, where Socrates really kind of takes the consequences away and says, okay, they won't have any money, they won't have any real status in society other than what they have through ruling, they won't have any real material comforts and so on. Adimantus kind of breaks in and he's not really happy with this, and he even kind of comes back and he says, but the things that conventionally are held to make people happy, they won't have any of those things, but it seems as if he really sort of considers that to be a real objection to what's going on. So he sort of kind of backtracks here and says, well, now wait a minute. When I said praise justice, not the consequences, I didn't mean take away all the consequences like Glaucon did. It turns out actually, I think that just people should have those things. We just shouldn't focus on that. We just shouldn't say that that's the reason for being just. But again, here he seems to be a little bit divided, and Socrates. Here, Adimantus seems to be a little divided from what he had said earlier, going back a little bit, wanting these consequences after all. And Socrates even sort of intensifies Adimantus' accusation. And he says, and there are other things that they won't have, and a whole lot of other things. And Adimantus says, sure, add those to the accusation. So Socrates replies, and the first thing he says is, well, it wouldn't be surprising if these men, as they are also happiest. So he actually suggests, well, maybe these will be the happiest people in the city. Maybe genuine happiness doesn't have anything to do with property or with wealth or even with privacy or any of that. Maybe these people will end up being happiest after all. But then he goes on and makes this point, which comes up in other places of the Republic as well, that, remember, we're trying to found a just city. We're trying to found a happy city. And we're not looking to make any particular part of the city happy. We're looking to found an actual good, just city. So, so the point here is not to make the rulers happy. The point is to found a just city. And if that means subordinating the happiness of the rulers to the good of the city as a whole, then that's what we should do. And so, he sort of goes on about this a little bit. And of course he says, comes back to this idea, well, look, I mean, if a shoemaker is corrupt in some way, or a shoe mender is corrupt in some way, that wouldn't be ruinous for the city. But if guardians are, if rulers are, then that would be even worse. So again, the idea that obviously the guard, although it's one man, one job, the job of the guardians, the job of the rulers is much more important for the city than the job of the craftsmen and so on. And again, he comes back to the idea that each individual is doing their job as well as possible, and that again that's the sort of foundation of the city. That's the organizing principle of the city. Everybody has one job. They do that as well as possible, and they're not primarily looking to their own personal, private happiness. They're looking to what's good for the city. And again, it's been decided that what's best for the city is for each person to have one job and to do that job as well as possible. So he comes back to that idea, and then he says, kind of at the end of his speech, we must let nature assign to each of the groups its share of happiness. So again, each person has this job that they're naturally suited for. They should do it as well as possible for the good of the city. And then, as he says, we'll let nature assign happiness to them. Each will be as happy as again, because their job is based on their nature, on what they're naturally suited to do. So he says, so we'll let nature assign happiness to each person as they do their job. And again, he says the point here is not to arrange the city so that the rulers are happiest. And Adimantus is largely convinced by this. So Socrates goes on then, and he says basically that the city needs to be neither wealthy nor poor, that both of these things would corrupt people, would corrupt the craftsmen in particular. So we know that the rulers won't have any real money, they won't be able to handle gold or silver, but he says the craftsmen as well, if they become too wealthy, then they won't do their trade. If they're too poor, then they won't have enough money to do it well, and so on. So he says, we need a kind of moderate amount of wealth in this city. People shouldn't be too wealthy, they shouldn't be too poor. And again, that's for the craftsmen. The rulers themselves won't have any property at all, really. But the craftsmen shouldn't be one extreme or the other. They shouldn't be too wealthy, shouldn't be too poor. And Adimantus here kind of steps in and says, okay, but Socrates, what would you say about going to war against a wealthy city? How would that work? Wouldn't a wealthy city be better equipped to take on a city with no wealth? And Socrates, he sort of begins by saying, well, is that true? Wouldn't they be sort of rich and pampered, and we would be champion fighters and so on, and wouldn't it be easier for us to take on them? And Adimantus says, well, maybe not two at the same time. And then Socrates says, well, that would actually be easiest, because then you just play them off against each other. And he says, and if you go to one city, if there's our city that's being founded in the Republic, and there are two wealthy cities that want to take it over to colonize it, and they form some sort of an alliance to do so, because again, maybe they know this city, there's an entire class that just practices war, so they realize that they can't go against it alone, so they make this alliance. But Socrates says, well, that would be easy. We just go to one of the cities and say, well, it's not even lawful for us to handle gold or silver. So if you turn against your ally and help us conquer this other city, then you can have all of their riches, because we can't even take it. We, the rulers, are not even allowed to handle this stuff. So, you can keep all of it. Obviously, that would be good for you. So Socrates says, it would be easy to break up that alliance. turn these cities that seem to be threatening us against each other. And Adimantus says, but then you've got one powerful, even more wealthy city that's even more dangerous. And Socrates replies in a sort of interesting way. He says, well, you're not really. We don't really have one city. What you actually have inside of these large, very wealthy cities are a whole different groups, and therefore different little cities making up this whole. And those smaller cities within the whole, these smaller groups, the classes, the wealthy and the poor, for instance, and he says, and each of those are divided into further little competitive groups and so on. But just take the differences between the wealthy and the poor. He says, really, every city is divided at least into those two major groups, and all that we need to do is go in and essentially, he says, we'll foment civil war. When we're threatened by one city, we'll go in, and that city, because it's not like ours, because it's not well founded like ours, will be very susceptible to this, will be very vulnerable to this. The different classes, the different groups will be, fighting against each other, maybe not, completely openly, but there will be the possibility for this. The city will be divided into these different groups, and so he says, we'll go in and we'll promise to the one either the wealth and the property, and he says even the persons. So maybe we'll even suggest that we'll help them enslave the other class. If they will, then join with us, and then we can kind of destroy the city that way, make the other city weak, and maybe, if one class ends up on top, then they will be our allies for that reason. If not, then there's always going to be this other class within the city, and so, obviously this is again a somewhat harsh, like some of the aspects of Book 3, maybe a somewhat harsher view than you might have expected from Socrates. Later on, he has a more sort of live and let live foreign policy that he suggests, where they try as much as possible not to do harm. But here, of course, it's very much about doing harm. And of course, if you go back to Book 1 and the agreement he had made with Polemarchus that the just man harms no one, you might come back and say, well, how is this just, though? Turning these cities against each other, fomenting civil war within a city, maybe helping one class enslave the other. Clearly, these things involve harm. How is any of this just? And Socrates' response may be, well, it's not just. Sometimes in order to protect yourself, you have to do things that are unjust, especially when it's one city against another in the sort of international sphere. Again, we're clearly not talking about nations, but in the international sphere, maybe it's even more deadly and dangerous, and there's even less margin for any kind of error or any kind of overly noble or overly high-minded concern for justice, that you have to do things that are unjust to protect yourself from other cities that, after all, want to invade and conquer you, simply to colonize you, to take your stuff, to plunder you. I mean, it's not as if we're, doing this to them. We're not just finding a random city that's trying to behave itself and going in and destroying it. If we're threatened by enemies, maybe we do have to harm people in order to protect ourselves. And maybe in a strict sense, that's not just, but maybe it's necessary. But anyways, he doesn't really, he doesn't really follow up on all that. He just says, look, if you're worried about the foreign policy, if you're worried about how we'll defend ourselves against other cities, if we keep to this sort of moderate amount of wealth, if we don't have money, is money necessary to have a strong army to defend yourself well against other cities, especially wealthy cities? And he says no for these reasons. So this is sort of how he explains all of this. Okay, and so basically he goes on and he sort of, there's a kind of a very brief mention of the community of women and children. He says, we'll have all of these things, women, children, all of these things kept according to the old saying that friends have all things in common. Adimantus just says yes. The beginning of Book 5, it sort of begins with Polemarchus stopping and Adimantus, and he's saying, well, what did you mean by that? That was an odd thing to say. What did that actually mean? You just kind of glossed over that very quickly, but what did you actually mean by that? And Socrates has to explain it at length. Here he just mentions it and moves on, and then he basically goes on, he starts to talk about all the different things in the city. He gives a lot of very specific things, like as your translation says, hairdos, shoes, all of these things. He seems to suggest that there's a certain civic interest in having the right kind of these things, but he says there's no point in trying to legislate for all of these things. There's no point in trying to specify what kind of a haircut somebody should have or what kind of shoes that they should wear. He says either the fundamental laws and the education that come from them is basically correct, in which case these things will largely take care of themselves, or it's not, in which case these things won't take care of themselves. And he compares it to someone he compares it to somebody's physical health. And he says, unjust cities or sick cities are like someone who eats too much and drinks too much, and they wonder why they're sick, and they go to the doctor, and the doctor, of course, tells them, well, stop eating too much, stop drinking too much, stop overindulging, and you'll get healthy. But they don't want to hear that. They don't actually want to give up this life of overindulgence, so they keep hoping that there's a special medicine or some kind of a magical spell that somebody can do, something that will enable them to continue this life of overindulgence and yet not suffer the consequences, not be sick. And Socrates says cities are the same way. When they're unjust, when the laws are not proper, then they're given in to all sorts of licentiousness and sickness and disorder and so on. And of course, the way to change it would be to change the more fundamental laws, change the types of education that people have. But the cities don't want to hear this. They don't actually want to go through those fundamental changes. They want to keep practicing the same type of life that they have, and yet somehow avoid the negative consequences. So he says, as long as the fundamental laws are sound and the education that comes from them are sound, then he says we don't need to get into details about legislating every single thing involving contracts, all of this. We'll create gentlemen, and they'll know how to conduct themselves in private life and business and all of these examples that he gives. So he says, we're not going to legislate for everything. He even makes a kind of surprising assertion at 424a that he says sound rearing and education produce good natures, which again is sort of as if nature is just the product of education or rearing. But of course, this harmonizes with what or jibes with what Adeimantus had said in his speech that justice is naturally good, and yet people are convinced to be unjust based on their education. So it's sort of again there's this view that maybe nature is sort of relatively weak compared to education, compared to the way that people are taught to behave or taught what to believe about justice. So Socrates kind of maybe appeals to that part of Adeimantus here, makes it seem as if just the proper laws, the proper education will produce all the right things. I mean, maybe that's an overstatement, but in any case, the basic idea that there are many things that the city has a particular interest in seeing have a particular type or a particular way of doing things. So again, many things that might seem private to us in our society today, involving personal dress and appearance, also involving contracts and so on. He says we can't actually legislate for those. We just have to educate people correctly, and then they'll know the right thing to do. He says as long as these laws are fundamentally sound, then we'll produce people who basically know how to handle these things correctly. So he stresses again and again, do not change the education. And then he says, so then if we've got the right education, we've got the right laws, then maybe we should look for justice. And he says, have Glaucon and Polemarchus and all these other people help you. And here Glaucon breaks in and says, no nonsense, you said that you would help us look, so you have to. And then begins the next part of the conversation, the actual search for justice in the city.